the sleep-inducing bread banned by monks after strange night cries. Imagine the hush of a medieval monastery just after Compline. The last prayers have been whispered. Candles are extinguished, one by one. A few glowing embers remain in the hearth, casting faint light across the cloister walls. The corridors are dark, save for the moonlight spilling through high, narrow windows. Stone and silence press in on all sides. And yet, tonight, the silence does not hold. From one of the dormitories comes a sound, not loud, but strange, a cry, muffled and low, as if someone is speaking into their sleep. Then another, and another. Not shouts, but murmurs, disjointed phrases, a chant without rhythm. When the senior monks investigate, they find 3 brethren still lying in their beds unmoving, pale, but breathing, difficult to rouse. Their skin cool, their pulse slow. No sign of fever, no injury, just sleep that clings too tightly. And then, one of them stirs. He opens his eyes slowly, looks around, and says almost dreamily, "There were voices in the wall." The event was not forgotten. In the early 14th century, in a monastery near the River Saône, a small group of Benedictine monks experienced what the records would later call somnus profundus inusitatus, an unusual, profound sleep. The entry in the abbey's chronicle is brief but unmistakable. 3 of the brethren did fall into heavy sleep after the midday meal and could not be stirred until the second dawn. Upon waking, they spoke of sounds and murmurings from the stone itself. The prior took notice, and after brief inquiry, one change stood out: the bread. For some weeks, the monastery's cook had been using a different rye, a coarser grain, acquired cheaply from a nearby miller. It had been darker than usual, slightly sour, but it baked well and filled the belly. Only after the 3rd such episode did the cook admit he had noticed a faint powdery bloom on some of the loaves, a dusting he'd assumed to be flour. But the prior had read the old herbal texts. He had heard whispers from other monasteries. He ordered the bread burned, the oven scrubbed, and the grain cast into the river. The monks never ate that rye again. We might recognize the cause now as ergot, a fungus that infects rye and other cereals, particularly in damp conditions. It produces compounds related to alkaloids, some of which have hallucinogenic effects. Ergotism in its more extreme forms could cause seizures, hallucinations, even death. But in lesser doses, it brought on vivid dreams, altered sensation, and in rare cases, a sleep so deep it was difficult to distinguish from coma. To the monks, however, it was not biology, it was mystery. They called it the bread that listens. Several described, after waking, not dreams, but spaces. Stone corridors that should not have existed. Voices not heard, but felt. A monk named Brother Matthias, known for his silence and devotion, claimed that during his sleep he had walked through the nave of the church, but it had been empty and the walls had breathed. He wrote in the margin of his psalter, "The stone heard me. I asked no question, but it answered." The entry was later scratched out, not erased, but crossed through with a single line, a subtle signal that it was not to be read aloud. From that point on, the monastery returned to its original grain, and a rule was added, not written into the rule of Saint Benedict, but spoken and remembered. Do not eat what alters prayer. Bread, for monks, was more than food. It was rhythm, stability. Each day's loaf came from the labor of their own hands. The plowing, the harvesting, the grinding, the kneading. Bread was humility made edible, a poor man's sacrament. And so when that bread became suspect, when it began to disturb rather than nourish, it was felt deeply. It wasn't only that monks feared illness. It was that altered perception blurred the line between devotion and delusion. Monastic life depended on discipline, on the predictable cycle of hours. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. Time was kept in bells and bread, and anything that disrupted that cycle, especially sleep, was cause for concern. After the incident, the monks took to observing one another more carefully. Any prolonged drowsiness after meals was noted. Loaves were tasted by the infirmarian before being served. And for a time, the midday meal became simpler, just pottage, water, and flatbread. Interestingly, nearby villages told their own stories. One shepherd, according to a local scribe, claimed that when he ate bread made from the same dark rye, he dreamed of doors beneath the church, doors that opened into blackness. Another, a brewer's wife, said her daughter fell into sleep so deep she missed 3 days of market and woke weeping, saying she had been spoken to by the stones near the abbey wall. The prior dismissed these tales publicly, but privately, it seems he kept notes. A small booklet remains in the monastery's archive, unnamed and unsigned, listing strange episodes tied to spoiled grain. The last line reads, "When the wall speaks, the body is not hungry, but the soul forgets its hour." Eventually, the episodes faded. The bread returned to normal. The sleepers stayed awake, and the monastery resumed its quiet rhythm. But for years afterward, during the blessing of the meal, an extra phrase was added, softly, never written, only passed from one refectory reader to the next. May this food bring wakefulness and not shadow. Even centuries later, visiting friars would sometimes ask if this was the abbey where the bread made monks dream of the walls. The hosts would smile politely, offer simpler fare. No rye. Today, we understand more about fungal toxins and food safety, but the memory of the event lingers quietly in footnotes and marginalia. Not because it was frightening, but because it brushed against something deeper. The idea that food could touch not just the body, but the veil between worlds. That nourishment, when spoiled, could loosen the knots of perception. The monks didn't need proof. They had heard the night cries. They had seen the sleepers. And they had felt, however briefly, that something ancient moved in the quiet stone when the wrong bread was broken. And so they stopped, and watched, and listened, because even in a life devoted to silence, some voices come when sleep is deepest, and not all bread is made to feed the waking. The brew that put an entire castle's guards to sleep for 2 days. Imagine a castle tucked into a low valley. Stone walls thick with lichen, narrow slits of windows, heavy wooden gates drawn closed each evening with the same practiced rhythm. Inside, the fortress breathes with quiet routines. Fires lit, boots stacked, weapons checked. And among those routines, perhaps the most vital, the changing of the guard. But on one strange occasion, there would be no changing. No footsteps along the ramparts. No torchlights circling the walls. Just silence, because the guards had all fallen asleep. And when they finally awoke, 2 days later, something had changed. Not in their memories, which remained curiously blank, but in the very stone of the fortress itself. Cryptic markings now covered parts of the inner curtain wall, carved deep, clean, fresh enough to flake stone dust when touched. No one heard the chiseling, no one saw a tool, and no one, to this day, has explained what those symbols meant, or how they got there. The story is preserved not in royal decree or religious record, but in a cluster of regional annals, household letters, and a peculiar entry in the personal journal of a steward named Alwyn, dated around 1294. He served at a small but fortified estate in the borderlands, an area prone to both political tension and long, uneventful stretches of eerie calm. The guards, he wrote, were felled not by blade nor by flame, but by brew. The drink in question had been a gift, an offering sent from a nearby manor, supposedly in thanks for a recently resolved land dispute. It arrived in a cask, marked simply with the word hearth grain. To all appearances, it was an ordinary ale. Dark, slightly sour, brewed with fermented grains common to the region. The sort of thing guards might drink by the hearth during the evening watch. Not to intoxication, but for comfort against the cold. And yet, by the following morning, every sentry was unconscious. Not drunk, not ill, simply asleep. And not lightly. Nothing stirred them. Not horns, not daylight, not even the slap of cold water. Alwyn noted that their breathing was steady, their color unchanged. They did not seem poisoned. There were no convulsions. Just an unnatural, total stillness. It lasted more than 36 hours. By the time they stirred, the entire castle had slipped into a sort of suspended unease. Servants whispered. The steward kept the outer gates barred. No one was allowed in or out. And then someone noticed the wall. Specifically, a portion of the inner courtyard that had been cleaned the day before. Worn, yes, but smooth. Now it was etched, not with names, not with warnings, but with lines, symbols, interwoven arcs and shapes that bore no clear language. Some said they resembled maps. Others saw script. A few believed they mimicked constellations, or wounds, or waves. The marks were carved with precision, too deeply and evenly to have been done quickly, or in secret by hand. And yet they were new. Alwyn's journal described them as fresh cuts, smooth but sharp, as though no tool touched them, and yet all stone obeyed. No one in the castle admitted to hearing anything unusual. No hammer, no grinding, not even a voice. The guards themselves remembered nothing. They described going to sleep as usual, perhaps slightly more tired than normal, but no strange taste in the ale, no dizziness, no dreams. The incident became a matter of quiet confusion. No investigation was recorded, perhaps because the region was too remote, or because no harm had come. The markings were not destroyed, but neither were they celebrated. Some were eventually weathered away. Others, tucked beneath a narrow overhang, remain faintly visible today, according to a few modern surveys of ruined sites. But the questions lingered. Was the ale drugged? And if so, by whom and why? There were theories. Some suspected rival lords, testing a new method of invasion. Others blamed traveling monks or apothecaries experimenting with wild herbs or fungal fermentation. There are records from the same period describing a drink called merksleep, brewed in secret for sedative purposes using roots, mold, and aged grain. It was said to induce a dreamless state so deep that birds could nest on your chest without waking you. But there was no invasion, no theft, no fire, no enemy ever came. Only the silence, the sleep, and the markings. A few accounts, those written decades later, suggest something stranger. That the markings pulsed faintly at night. That animals refused to pass near them. That one child, barely old enough to speak, pointed to the stone and said simply, "It remembers." These are embellishments, perhaps. Legends growing around an odd event. But even in the plainest version, the facts remain curious. A gifted brew, a full garrison in enforced slumber, and a message or map or warning, carved with no witness and no explanation. Some say the markings were a test, a threshold passed by the fortress itself, not its people. That the sleep was a kind of agreement, that something, or someone, used the moment to write into stone what could not be said aloud. Others believe it was a mistake, that the brew was never meant for the guards, that it was a ritual offering misdirected, a recipe lost, a prayer never meant to be drunk. We cannot know. What we can know is this. For 2 days, the fortress stood unguarded, and yet, nothing attacked it, nothing entered, except the markings. And perhaps that is what unsettles us most. Not what was lost, but what was added. Even now, ruins remain scattered across old frontiers. Many contain odd carvings, some explained, some not. In one such site, A series of marks resembles those described in Alwyn's journal. Circular, patterned, deep. No one knows who etched them. No one knows when. But on certain nights, if you stand near the stone and close your eyes, the air feels heavy, like something was once here, and chose to leave only a message. While we slept, the spice stew that made servants dream in foreign languages. Imagine the kitchen of a quiet stone manor just after sundown. The hearth is glowing, casting long shadows across worn wooden tables. A pot hangs over the fire, heavy, bubbling slowly. The air is thick with scent, warm fat, dried root, crushed seeds, and a strange sweetness that doesn't quite belong. Outside the kitchen walls, the rest of the household prepares for rest. But tonight, their dreams will not be ordinary. The event was recorded only briefly in a household log from the year 1474, on the northern border of Burgundy. A single line in the steward's neat script reads, "The cook was removed. The broth caused fevered sleep, and speech not our own." But in the margins, added in a different hand, someone wrote more. They muttered in tongues not heard before. The walls repeated them for nights after. The pot was emptied into the earth and covered with salt. The story might have faded with time, if not for other, similar whispers found in letters and regional accounts. Always the same outline. A seasoned dish prepared with uncommon spices, consumed by an entire household, followed by deep and dream-heavy sleep and voices, spoken not while waking, but muttered in foreign languages no one in the house could understand. The stew in this particular story was described later, unofficially, as dark, rich, and strange. It had been prepared with mutton, lentils, black pepper, and saffron, but also with imported ingredients unfamiliar to the household, possibly galangal, fenugreek, or even powdered poppy seed. All were technically known, traded through apothecaries and spice merchants, but few in the manor had tasted them, let alone all at once. It was a feast night. Everyone partook, the family, the chambermaids, even the stable hands. According to one surviving page from a servant's diary, sleep came quickly. Not the slow drift of exhaustion, but a sudden pull, as if the body had simply been dismissed. And then the voices began. Some spoke in clear, unfamiliar words. Others chanted low and rhythmic, as though part of an old ritual. One man sat upright in bed and began listing names no one recognized. A maid wept softly in a dialect she'd never learned. Even the dogs howled, not in pain, but as if responding to something spoken far away. The following morning, the manor woke late. Most remembered only fragments. Doorways that opened into desert cities, staircases that led to mountains made of glass, conversations with strangers whose words were understood in the dream, and completely forgotten upon waking. The noble family, unnerved but unharmed, quietly dismissed the cook. No punishment, only removal. The remaining stew was buried in the garden, and, according to the steward's own hand, a layer of salt was poured over it, to still the tongue of the root. Why did this happen? No one claimed poison. There were no deaths, no fever, just an unshakable sense that the meal had opened something, some door or memory or language beneath language. And in a time when the mind was seen as both vulnerable and sacred, that was enough. Food was never just nourishment in medieval life. It was medicine, symbol, and story. Herbs carried meanings. Spices had reputations. Nutmeg could warm the heart. Rue could repel evil. And poppy, while prized for pain relief, was used with care. Too much, and sleep became a sea without shores. Some believe the stew simply contained too many ingredients that relax the body and loosen the tongue. Perhaps a mild sedative effect, worsened by hunger and wine. Others point to the psychological power of shared suggestion. One person dreaming strangely might be coincidence. An entire household dreaming in unison? That enters the realm of folklore. And then there were the walls. Multiple notes suggest that in the days following the stew, faint whispers were heard in the stone hallways, especially near the servants' quarters. No one claimed to see anything, but the sounds, low, echoing, just out of comprehension, persisted. One stable boy refused to enter the west stairwell alone for weeks, claiming it mumbled at night. Could this have been imagination? A lingering haze of expectation? Perhaps. But the manor's residents believed otherwise. In many parts of medieval Europe, it was said that stone absorbed emotion and sound, that enough grief, anger, or prayer could settle into walls. And in this case, perhaps language too. Over time, the story softened into cautionary tale. Later cooks were told to use spice sparingly, especially those not grown in local soil. The tongue does not know what the stomach will remember. One housekeeper wrote in a recipe margin, "No one tried the same blend again." Interestingly, a century later, a small bundle of dried herbs and resin was discovered bricked into the chimney near the manor kitchen. It was wrapped in linen, stitched with symbols, and tucked into a hollow behind the hearthstone. Possibly an old charm meant to seal the space after the stew. An attempt to keep the dreams from returning. So tonight, as you imagine that quiet kitchen, the hearth crackling low, the last bowls emptied, the hallways growing dark, picture the moment when sleep settles over the household. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. The kind of sleep that doesn't just restore, but remembers. And in the hush that follows, listen gently. You may hear words not your own, spoken softly, from far away, as if the walls are still trying to understand what was said that night, when the stew was spiced too well, and every dream became a language without a name. The boiled root that caused sleep and sudden death among peasants. Imagine a bitter spring, where the snow has melted but the ground gives nothing back. The grain stores are nearly empty, the last onions soft and pale. In the low cottages at the edge of the village, smoke rises not from cooking, but from damp sticks burned simply for warmth. A child asks when the bread will return. A mother says soon, knowing it is not true. This was the world into which famine-foraged roots were introduced, not as delicacy, not even as food, but as desperate experiment. Beneath hedges and low hillsides, peasants dug for anything that might boil. One such plant, later identified in folk herbals but never clearly named, grew deep into clay soil, its twisted tubers bitter and waxy. It was not poisonous in the immediate sense. Some said it was related to the cowbane. Others swore it resembled the wild parsnip, but its true name was lost or deliberately erased from oral history. What's remembered is what it did. Villagers would slice it thin and boil it for hours, sometimes with onion skin or crushed barley husks. The resulting broth was thin, grayish, and tasted, according to one account, like earth washed clean with sorrow. Families ate it together, often in silence. It filled the stomach, dulled the gnawing ache, and, on certain nights, sent everyone into an uncommonly deep sleep. But this sleep was not like others. There were no dreams, no murmured words, no shifting beneath the covers. Some described it as a stillness so profound it resembled death. In some cottages, those who shared the pot of soup would not wake the next morning. In others, they would rise after a full day and night, disoriented, dry-mouthed, and uneasy. And then there were the markings, rough scratches along the inside walls, patterns no one remembered carving, circles within circles, intersecting triangles, long lines drawn low to the floor, often shallow, made with a dull blade or bone. Too precise for children, too random for decoration. In more than one case, neighbors were summoned to confirm. Yes, that was not there before. Chroniclers of the time, when they mention this phenomenon at all, do so with caution. One 15th-century cleric notes, with restrained phrasing, that in the northern district certain households consumed the bitter root of hunger and found upon waking that their walls bore strange instruction. He offers no interpretation. He simply adds that Mass was said daily for their protection. The roots were not uniformly dangerous. Some families ate them and survived without incident. Others fell ill. A few simply never woke. Over time, patterns emerged. Roots harvested from shaded hillsides seemed more potent. Those boiled in iron pots more likely to cause the deep stillness. And always, the markings appeared only after group sleep. Never with individual meals. Never when shared with outsiders. What could cause such things? Modern scholars suggest the root may have contained alkaloids, naturally occurring compounds that in certain doses induce paralysis, hallucination, or amnesia. Others point to fungal contamination or toxic mold introduced during boiling. But these explanations, while plausible, do not satisfy the full shape of the reports, because the strangeness was not only in the sleep, but in what followed. One family in a mountain village awoke to find their sleeping mats rearranged and their front door unlatched, though no one had entered. In another case, a girl claimed to have heard scratching during the night, but could not move or cry out. When she awoke, her hair was braided in a pattern her mother did not recognize. The markings, too, seemed to spread. In one recorded case, a cottage wall bearing these carvings was later dismantled and repurposed in a granary. The grain stored there was said to spoil faster, and livestock kept nearby refused to settle. In response, some communities forbade the roots collection. Others burned the plants where they found them. But hunger is rarely so easily persuaded. The root continued to be dug in secret, boiled in back huts, and eaten by those who could not bear another night of empty stomachs. Over time, the practice faded, not from cure or revelation, but from fear. Those who had seen the sleep did not speak of it easily, and those who had awoken beside strange walls often left them behind. But traces remain. In remote valleys, in the oldest farmsteads, beneath layers of lime wash, some claim you can still find the faintest of lines. Circles cut with uncertain hands. Not decorative. Not useful. Just present. A memory etched into plaster. A record of something that passed through while the body lay still. So if you ever walk in a ruined cottage where famine once hollowed out the hearth, run your fingers across the stone. If you feel something uneven, something deliberate, pause, and ask yourself what was cooked here, and what it asked in return. The cheese that made pilgrims see living faces in chapel walls, in the quiet corners of the medieval world. Certain stories passed not through official chronicles or noble proclamations, but in murmurs among travelers, whispers at monastery gates, and scribbled notes in the margins of forgotten herbals. One such tale began not with a king, nor a war, but with a cheese, soft, white, and faintly sweet. Imagine yourself in a small stone chapel near the base of a pilgrimage trail, sometime in the late 13th century. The air is damp with the breath of nearby forests. Candles flicker in niches worn smooth by fingers brushing past in reverence. Travelers arrive in small groups, their cloaks stiff with dust and weather, their feet blistered and aching. They come for prayer, for rest, for absolution, and sometimes for the kindness of a small meal offered by the resident brothers. It was here that a certain cheese entered the story. No one remembers its name, though local records describe it as soft and yielding, crafted from goat's milk with a washed rind and flecks of marjoram. It was often served in thin slices with brown bread, and a bitter herbal tea said to settle the stomach after long walks. The monks offered it freely to pilgrims who passed through their modest chapel. For years, it nourished without incident. But one season, perhaps after a particularly rainy spring or a spoiled batch left too long in the cellar, things began to shift. A handful of pilgrims began to sleep longer than expected, falling into deep, dream-heavy rest in the chapel's guest quarters. They could not be roused for hours. When they finally awoke, each described eerily similar visions. The walls of the chapel had come alive with faces, ancient, sorrowful, and watching. Not painted icons or carvings, but living stone. Faces that breathed ever so slightly. Faces that blinked slowly, mournfully. Some described a sensation of being watched even after waking, as if the chapel itself retained some awareness of them. The brothers listened politely, offered prayer, and quietly buried their unease beneath layers of routine. It would have been easy to dismiss the claims, if not for their consistency. Dozens of travelers, from different regions and backgrounds, described nearly identical experiences. The descriptions aligned not just in the broad strokes, but in peculiar details. The shape of the eyes, the movement of the lips, even the sensation of distant chanting behind the stone. Some monks began avoiding the east wing entirely. Others scrubbed the walls with holy water or herbs, muttering passages under their breath as they worked. Still, the visions continued. Later chroniclers speculated that the cheese may have developed ergot, a fungus that sometimes grew on rye and could cause hallucinations, though it was rare in dairy. Others blamed local herbs, noting that marjoram and wormwood, both known to grow near the chapel, could affect the mind when improperly used. A few whispered of something older, something sacred and strange, bound to the stone itself. Theories spiraled out over centuries, like threads unraveling from a forgotten tapestry. But to truly understand why this story lingered, why it passed from pilgrim to pilgrim long after the chapel fell into ruin, we must look beyond the hallucination itself. The medieval world was thick with signs. Every rustle of leaves, every star pattern, every dream was taken seriously. People believed that the divine or the demonic could speak through mundane things. Visions were not merely dismissed. They were studied, feared, sometimes even recorded as messages. In this context, a face in a wall was not madness. It might be warning, or penance, or a glimpse of something hidden behind the veil of daily toil. Pilgrimage was never only about reaching a shrine. It was about transformation. The road changed people, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually. Hunger, solitude, repetition, and ritual blurred the line between waking and dreaming. The cheese was only part of the equation. These travelers were already in a liminal state, between worlds, between sins and forgiveness, between identity and anonymity. The chapel, too, was transitional. It sat far from towns, perched at the edge of a thick forest, along a little-used road. Its stones were quarried from older ruins, local legends said, a Roman fort, perhaps, or even something pre-Christian. The masonry bore strange marks beneath the mortar. Pilgrims rarely noticed them unless they lingered after dusk, when the last rays of sun caught certain grooves and seemed to give them depth. Over time, the visions faded. The cheese was quietly discontinued. A fire gutted part of the chapel, and what remained was used by charcoal burners and shepherds. Eventually, the roof collapsed. Moss overtook the walls. The last official mention comes from a 16th-century bishop's travel log, who wrote, "The stones here are much worn. Locals say they hold memory. I found no proof, but could not bring myself to sleep inside." Today, all that remains are a few moss-covered ruins deep in the woods of what is now southwestern France. Hikers sometimes pass through. Some say the area feels oddly silent. A few even mention a sensation of being watched. But there is no cheese, no monks, no prayers echoing from within. Only stone, and time, and whatever memory lives between them. So imagine yourself there. The woods thick around you. The air still. You sit on a fallen block, feeling the cool grit of lichen against your palm. You close your eyes, just for a moment, and when you open them again, you might find that the stone is no longer just stone. Not dangerous, not evil, just watching. watching and remembering, just as the Pilgrims once did, just as the walls always have. The wine that made a baron sleep through a siege and hear whispers. Imagine the flicker of torches inside a fortified manor house. Stone walls rise tall against the night. The courtyard lies still, its echo quieted by frost and late autumn leaves. Somewhere beyond the outer wall, the sounds of the forest blend with distant horses, a rhythm too soft to raise alarm. Inside, tapestries hang heavy to ward off the cold, and servants walk softly in felted shoes. All is quiet, except for the faint clink of a goblet being set down. The baron has retired early. Not from illness, not from fatigue, but from indulgence, a gift he could not resist. A rare fruit wine, crimson and thick, had been brought to him by a merchant from the southern coast, said to be pressed from a fruit that only grew near saltwater cliffs, harvested under the full moon. An exaggeration, no doubt, but the baron had been curious and indulgent, and now he slept. He slept too well. When the attack began, just after the third watch, no one could wake him. The alarm bell rang. Guards scrambled along the battlements. A siege force moved through the trees, testing the walls. Torches flared. Arrows whispered. And yet the baron did not stir. His chamber door was thrown open. Candles lit. Shouts echoed. Still he lay motionless, eyes closed, breathing slow and even, not ill, not dead, simply unreachable. And when the danger passed, when dawn rose and the enemy withdrew, frustrated by the defender's readiness, the baron finally woke. His first words were strange. "The walls spoke to me," he said. "They told me to rest, but also warned me. I dreamed of stone and fire." The episode became a quiet legend, not widely spread, not mocked, but remembered in the margins of household accounts and local chronicles. The baron's deep sleep, one steward called it, a night of siege, unheard by its lord. Later, the baron insisted he had dreamed the entire thing, that the attack, the guards, the cries, had all unfolded in his sleep, but not as fantasy. As message, he described corridors not of the keep, but beneath it, hidden stairways carved into rock, voices, not angry, not clear, whispering warnings in a language he almost recognized. He said he had never slept so deeply, nor so vividly. Attention turned, eventually, to the wine. The merchant who brought it had vanished. No name was written in the guest ledger. Only a note, a gift of the southern harvest. The bottle, dark glass sealed with wax, was found half full on a silver tray. And despite curiosity, none in the household dared finish it. Some believed it had been drugged, that the baron was meant to be incapacitated, perhaps as part of the attack itself. Others thought it a coincidence, a strong drink after a long day, a tired man in a warm bed. But the baron's description of the voices unsettled even the most rational among his staff. He spoke not only of hearing them, but of feeling them, as if the walls had remembered something ancient, as if they had been waiting for someone to sleep deeply enough to listen. Such beliefs were not unheard of in the medieval world. Stone, especially old stone, was often thought to hold memory. Churches were said to echo not only voices, but sins. Castles, built layer by layer across generations, became more than buildings. They became witnesses. And in places where suffering or silence stretched across centuries, it was not uncommon to hear stories of stone that murmured in dreams. But wine? That was a stranger element. Wine was sacred and profane, ritual and reward. Monks fermented it in silence. Nobles toasted treaties with it. Peasants drank it diluted with water. And while strong wines were known to bring odd sleep, few could recall one that made a man unrousable while arrows struck the gates. The steward's log, recovered later in fragment, mentions testing the remaining wine on a servant. Just a sip. Enough to cause stillness, like death, for some hours. The boy awoke confused but unharmed. He too mentioned dreams. Not nightmares, but places. A tower seen from below. A voice in the stairwell calling his name. The bottle was buried after that, sealed in a lead box and placed beneath the chapel floor. It was not destroyed. Perhaps they feared what burning it might release. The Baron ruled for many years after the incident. A cautious man, but fair. He drank less, slept lightly, and when the keep was renovated in the late 1330s, he ordered the stone in his chamber walls to remain untouched. He told the masons, "Some stones have listened long enough. Let them rest." No further wine from the southern coast was accepted into the household. And yet, the story flickered on quietly. Minstrels sang of the dreaming lord in altered verses. Monks at a nearby priory recorded the event as divinum somnium, a divine sleep from which wisdom was drawn. And among the staff, the tale was told in a whisper, that during one night of danger, it was not the guards who warned the Baron, but the very keep he slept within. Whether real or imagined, the Baron never wavered in his belief. In his last years, he had a phrase carved above the threshold of his hall. Just 4 Latin words. Dormiens audivi murum loci. While sleeping, I heard the wall speak. Today, the manor is long gone. The walls collapsed. The stone repurposed in nearby buildings. But in some records, in the folds of parchment where sleep and history meet, the memory lingers. Of wine too rich for waking, of sleep too deep for reason, and of stone that whispers only to those who forget to listen while awake. You may never taste that wine, but should you find yourself dreaming beneath ancient stone, listen closely. You might find that it remembers, and sometimes it speaks back. The honey that sent children into trances and unlocked stone secrets. Imagine a quiet village in late spring. The orchards are buzzing with bees. Sunlight hangs low through the trees, golden and sticky. Children run barefoot through fields, their laughter skipping over stones and puddles. And in one corner of the manor yard, a gift arrives. A basket of combs heavy with wild honey, freshly harvested from hives nestled deep in the forest. No one questions it. The honey is shared among families, passed in clay pots and smeared across crusts of barley bread. The taste is sharp, almost floral, slightly bitter beneath the sweetness. Not unpleasant, just different. And then, the children begin to sleep. Not just a nap, not from heat or boredom, but a sleep too deep. One by one, they fall still, eyes closed, limbs relaxed, faces peaceful as if mid-dream. Parents try to wake them, gently at first, then with urgency. But their breathing is calm, their skin warm, and their bodies undisturbed. Just gone from waking life. It lasts days, not hours, days. In one preserved account, a letter written by a local priest to a nearby abbey in 1311, he describes 34 children, ranging from toddlers to young adolescents, all slipping into the same silent state within hours of consuming the honey. None showed signs of illness. Their pulses were steady. No fever, no rash. Just a deep, unshakable trance. And then they woke. Not all at once, but within the same morning. One rose from the floor where she'd been laid near the hearth. Another sat up suddenly in the church nave. Several blinked quietly, glanced around, and without speaking, began to walk. Together, what followed was stranger still. The children led the adults, not with urgency, not even with speech, but with a kind of calm certainty. They walked to the edge of the old manor house, a crumbling structure built over older stone. Without prompting, several pointed to a portion of wall near the southern side, an unremarkable patch of masonry. And one child, a boy of 7, placed his hand against the stone and said, "It waits." It took hours of prying and cautious labor, But behind the wall, they found it. A hidden chamber. Long sealed, long forgotten. No door, no hinges. Just stone that had once opened and had long since been buried by renovations and time. Inside was a small room, dry still, covered in carvings so weathered they were nearly indistinct. Symbols, spirals, marks of hands, and at the center, a stone basin lined with metal, filled with what appeared to be dust or ash. No one living knew of this chamber. No records mentioned it. No builder's plans accounted for the space. The manor had stood for over 100 years. And yet this room, this secret, had waited behind its walls, untouched and undisturbed. Until the honey. The origins of the honey were never fully traced. It had been collected by a traveling peddler from wild hives near the forest's edge, a region not commonly foraged due to local superstitions. Some believed the flowers there were touched by old spirits. Others said strange dreams followed those who walked too deep. But the honey was given freely, and no one suspected a thing. Only later would they recall the bees' odd behavior. Their movements too slow. Their hives unusually deep. The scent of the honey, earthy, yes, but with a note that lingered like smoke. Some scholars, centuries later, would speculate that the honey may have been a form of mad honey, a natural variant known to occur when bees feed on certain plants, producing neurotoxic compounds in trace amounts. This kind of honey is rare, but not unheard of. It can cause hallucinations, drowsiness, and altered states of awareness. But that does not explain what the children knew. They did not describe visions. They did not claim voices. Only a feeling, a pull, as if something had been waiting behind the wall for them to find it. And only in that silent sleep were they able to remember. What the chamber was remains unclear. Some believed it was an old crypt. Others thought it was a forgotten sanctuary, a room built by earlier hands, sealed away before the manor was ever raised. The carvings were never fully interpreted. Copies exist in monastic texts, but none have been conclusively translated. The basin contained no treasure, no bones, only fine dust and fragments of metal. Possibly ritual, possibly nothing. And yet, for the village, the discovery changed everything. For years afterward, children were kept from wild honey. Beekeepers avoided the forest edge. But each spring, small hands still traced spirals into the earth, as if they had not forgotten, as if the memory lingered somewhere beneath language, tucked behind the waking mind. The priest who first recorded the event returned to the chamber once, years later. By then, the manor had partially collapsed. The chamber was exposed to the air, and the carvings had faded. But he claimed he heard something while standing inside. A hum, low and steady, like bees, or perhaps like breath. Today, the story survives only in fragments, copied in marginalia, whispered in rural folklore, and half-remembered in the names of places no longer marked on maps. One such hill is still known locally as the Sleeping Step. A path nearby is called the Children's Line, and in a remote museum archive, one of the original combs, preserved in wax, still exists, darker than usual, laced with dried residue. No one has tasted it in over 700 years. No one dares. But if they did, would the sleep return? Would another wall fall away? Would something speak, not aloud, but in dreams, and guide us again to something long hidden? We cannot know, but the children did, and for a moment, their silence unlocked what stone alone never could. The ritual cake that made nuns sleep in synchrony for 72 hours. Imagine a convent tucked into the wooded edge of a late medieval valley. The air is still, cool with the scent of stone and pressed herbs. The bells have just stopped ringing. In the cloistered silence, the sisters move in measured rhythm. Soft steps over worn flagstone, hands folded, eyes lowered. On this particular evening, they gather not in the chapel, but in the refectory. The long table is laid with only one thing, a round, pale cake. Unfrosted, unadorned, fragrant with honey and fennel. Each nun receives one piece, eats in silence, and then, all at once, the pattern begins. This event, recorded in the private annals of a small convent near the Rhine in the late 1400s, was later referred to simply as the Long Sleep. It occurred following the celebration of a lesser-known feast day, perhaps of a regional saint, though the precise dedication has been lost. What remains is the testimony of the abbess, a few copies of the original entry made by visiting clergy, and the persistent legend that followed, that after consuming a sacred ritual cake, the entire order of nuns fell into a synchronized sleep lasting 72 hours. They did not wake at intervals. They did not shift or speak. They breathed deeply and steadily, as if wrapped in a single dream. When they woke, together at the exact hour of the third morning, they reported that the convent had spoken to them, not in a voice, exactly, but in presence, in image, and in prophecy. The cake itself was described plainly in the surviving account. Made from barley flour, honey, rosewater, and several dried herbs, fennel, hyssop, and angelica root. All of these ingredients were common enough in medieval convent kitchens, where herbs were often grown in small apothecary gardens. What was unusual was the inclusion of powdered seed from an unrecorded origin, likely a regional sedative, perhaps even poppy or wild lettuce, both known for inducing sleep. But what troubled the clergy who arrived afterward was not the cake's effect. It was its precision. Dozens of women, old and young, ill and healthy, fell asleep within minutes of one another. Their bodies slackened in prayer. A few were found kneeling in their cells, their heads bowed peacefully. Others were already lying in their beds. The effect was total, unyielding, and utterly without panic. They slept in harmony. One sister who remained untouched by the cake, too ill to attend the meal, described walking through the dormitory that night as passing through a living silence. She noted the rhythmic breath of every nun was the same pace, the same depth, as though they shared a single breath drawn across many bodies. Clergy were summoned. Physicians inspected the cake remains. There was no sign of rot, no bitterness on the tongue, no evidence of malice. What they found instead was calm. No signs of struggle, no twitching fever, or murmured distress. Just the same slow breathing and the subtle scent of herbs clinging to the air. When the sisters woke on the third morning, they gathered in the chapel of their own accord, without bell, without instruction. Each reported the same impression, that in their sleep, the walls of the convent had become aware. Not hostile, not divine, but attentive, as if the stones had opened, not to speak aloud, but to convey something old and buried. Each nun recalled slightly different fragments of what they were told. One described an image of the sea retreating from a shore. Another spoke of a bell tolling in a forest with no trees. A third remembered her own voice repeating a phrase she had never heard before. "You are the echo of something still waking." None of these images matched scripture, but they shared a pattern, a sense of being shown what comes after. The abbess, deeply shaken but not afraid, wrote in her ledger that she believed the convent had been granted a mirror dream, a single vision distributed across many minds. Not prophecy in the fiery sense, but guidance, a kind of spiritual recalibration. The ritual cake was never made again, not by decree, but by consensus. The sisters, though calm, agreed that the experience had been enough. Whatever door had opened during those 3 nights did not need to be opened twice. Historians looking back on the event have suggested several explanations, ranging from sedative overdose to mass psychological response. Some point to the known effects of group fasting followed by sudden feasting, which can cause extreme drowsiness. Others raise the possibility of ergot, a fungus that can contaminate grains and induce hallucinatory symptoms. But no such effects were reported. No tremors, no illness, no disorientation. Just sleep, deep and coordinated, and the strange knowledge that they had heard something not meant for waking ears. Interestingly, the convent records continued to reflect small changes in the years that followed. The nuns began reciting a short phrase before meals, unrelated to any known liturgy. A symbol resembling a doorway was carved into the chapel's threshold, and no guest was ever again permitted to enter the refectory alone. Today, the convent no longer stands. The valley was abandoned during a later conflict, and the stones repurposed. But fragments of the original altar remain in a nearby parish church, smooth with wear, quiet in the corner. Visitors sometimes say the acoustics there are strange, that whispers carry too easily, that when alone, you might feel you're not quite unheard. So tonight, picture that silent dormitory, the rows of narrow beds, the quiet breath of women lost in a shared dream, the faint scent of honey and fennel still lingering in the air, and the sense, not frightening, not wholly just present, that the walls around them were listening. And when they woke, they knew. The convent had spoken, and it remembered. The black soup that made prisoners forget time and hear voices. Imagine the inside of a medieval prison, damp, narrow, lit only by a high, barred slit of light that changes little with the hour. The walls are stone, stained from decades of smoke, mildew, and human breath. Chains hang unused but suggestive along the walls. The straw smells faintly of rot, and the air carries a metallic stillness. But in one corner, a bowl waits, filled not with water or wine or gruel, but a thick, dark liquid, almost black. Steam rises faintly from its surface. They called it soup, though it bore no resemblance to food. It was heavy, bitter, and strange, its ingredients never fully recorded. In some accounts, it appeared only in certain prisons, given not daily but periodically. Its presence wasn't punishment, nor reward. It was simply administered, without explanation, just once, just enough. The first mention appears in a 14th century ledger from a southern European fortress prison. A marginal note beside a list of food allocations reads, 1 measure of dark broth as before, administered at second moon. Nothing more. No recipe. No effect described. But elsewhere, in testimony, it begins to emerge. A prisoner who drank it once is said to have fallen asleep for nearly 2 days, neither waking to noise nor prodding. When he did rouse, he had no memory of the time lost. Not dreams, not images, only silence. His first words, according to a guard's account, were, "Did I speak while I slept?" Though none had heard a sound. This alone might be dismissed. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and the strange ferment of prison life could explain much. But the stories did not stop there. In cell after cell, weeks after the soup had been served, strange symbols began appearing, carved into wood, scratched into stone, smudged onto walls with soot and ash. Simple at first, lines, spirals, repeating dots. Then more complex, mirrored glyphs, symbols unknown to the scribes, shapes that defied clear meaning but echoed across cells. The prisoners denied making them. Some said they had never seen the marks before. Others claimed to find them in the morning, next to their bedding, behind their heads, or under their cots. A few said they dreamed of lightless corridors where voices echoed not with language, but with rhythm, pulsing tones that pulled thoughts apart and replaced them with image. But most remembered nothing, only the black soup. And then gaps. Chroniclers who investigated these reports did not reach consensus. Some believed the soup contained herbs long associated with trance, henbane, mandrake, or nightshade, plants that could cause confusion, visions, or sleep that felt like death. Others believed it was a psychological effect, an intentional disruption of identity, a means of softening the prisoner's sense of time, place, and even self. Because in medieval prisons, time itself was punishment. Unlike modern cells, where dates are counted down and clocks mark the hour, medieval incarceration was often indefinite. Prisoners waited not for release, but for confession, for judgment, or for death. In such liminal space, identity frayed. The black soup, some speculated, hastened this erosion. It was not meant to harm, but to empty. There were patterns in who received it. Those awaiting trial for heresy. Those caught spying. Those who refused to speak. It was rarely given to thieves or debtors. Only to those whose minds were as valuable, or as dangerous, as their deeds. In later records, guards describe entering a cell to find the walls covered in charcoal shapes, each drawn with remarkable precision. In one case, two prisoners in separate cells created identical sequences, despite never speaking. The prison chaplain reportedly burned the bedding afterward and ordered new stones laid. But the marks reappeared days later. And the voices. A few prisoners, especially those given the soup more than once, began to murmur in sleep, not in recognizable language, but in a cadence that repeated. One guard noted, "He speaks as if remembering something not yet told." Another, "The words are his mouth, but not his own." Were these hallucinations? Symptoms of poisoning? Echoes of trauma? Possibly. But even physicians who visited the sites admitted a degree of discomfort, not because of disease, but because of pattern. The drawings resembled nothing known, and yet they seemed familiar. In some prisons, the soup was banned entirely after a string of incidents. In one case, 3 prisoners given the soup separately were later found seated together in the same cell, despite no one having opened their doors. When questioned, each believed they had simply followed the sound. The warden at that site resigned. As with many medieval practices, knowledge of the black soup faded slowly, buried beneath generations of reform, secrecy, and shame. Recipes, if they ever existed, were not preserved. The roots or herbs used are still a matter of speculation. And yet the stories persist, in footnotes in local legends, and in the occasional unearthed cell wall where a sequence of marks still remains, shallow but deliberate. If you ever visit an old fortress-turned museum, walk quietly through its lower halls. Look not at the barred doors, but at the margins beneath windowsills behind support beams. You might see something scratched there, faint but regular. You might think it vandalism, or a prisoner's attempt at counting days. But then again, what if it's something remembered? Something that doesn't belong to language anymore? Something left behind by those who drank the black soup and forgot what time was? And maybe still remember, in some corner of the mind, a voice that speaks in marks, even after the mouth has gone silent. The feast that put a village to sleep and awoke them marked by stone. In the low hills of what is now Eastern Europe, not far from a bend in the river where trade once passed quietly by, there stood a village whose name has been mostly lost. Mentioned only briefly in a 14th century ledger and again, centuries later, in a letter never meant for publication. But for those who've studied folklore that brushes against history, the place is remembered not for its politics, nor its industry, but for a single event. A feast that lasted one night, followed by a silence that lasted far longer. Imagine yourself arriving just before harvest, sometime in the late medieval period. The air is cool but generous, heavy with the scent of crushed barley, damp earth, and smoke from slow-burning hearths. The harvest has been plentiful. Baskets overflow with apples and dark grapes. Wheat lies in bundled sheaves, leaning like soldiers at rest. The village is preparing for the final celebration of the season, a feast to honor the close of the growing year and to thank the saints for a quiet, safe season. These kinds of gatherings were common throughout Europe, and this one seemed no different at first. There were pies thick with roots and herbs, stews that had simmered for days, and loaves of sour bread split and shared among neighbors. Children ran barefoot in the dirt paths while elders sang old songs near the fire. The drink, it seems, was a strong one, brewed from late-season fruits and fermented in cool root cellars. It had a sweetness that crept up slowly. A few of the older villagers reportedly warned that it was too strong, that something had gone off, but by then, the feast had taken on its own rhythm. Pitchers were passed. Laughter echoed against the stone walls. Night came softly, and then, at some point between the singing and the silence, the village fell asleep. Not all at once, not like a spell in a story, but gradually, deeply, and completely. Those who were indoors dropped beside fires. Those still outside slumped against tables, their heads pillowed in arms or laps. Candles burned low. Dogs did not bark. No footsteps echoed. For nearly 2 full days, the village did not stir. It was the silence that alerted a passing merchant on the second morning. His calls went unanswered. The gates, such as they were, hung open. Chickens wandered untended. When he stepped inside, he later claimed he felt as though he'd entered a painting. Everything suspended, still breathing, but somehow paused. When the villagers finally began to wake, they did so slowly, confused and heavy-limbed. No one reported pain, or fear, or fever. Only dreams they couldn't quite describe. One man said he'd seen fields growing in reverse, unharvesting themselves. A child remembered a face made entirely of branches. But it wasn't the dreams that unsettled them. It was the handprints. Sometime during their sleep, something, or someone, had left marks. Pale handprints, dozens, on stone walls, on wooden beams, even on the inside of shuttered windows. Too large to be a child's, too delicate to be a craftsman's. Some were pressed low near thresholds, others high above reach, where no ladder had been placed. No pigment had been used. The prints were not painted. They were changes in the stone itself, lightened, as if bleached by centuries of sun in a single night. Many thought it a prank, but there had been no visitors, and the merchant who found them swore the gates had been closed when he arrived. There were no footprints in the frost. No dogs had barked, and the stones themselves were solid, nothing flaking or scrubbed away. Some villagers tried to erase the prints, scrubbing them with vinegar, then wine, then ash. Nothing worked. Others left offerings beside them, small bundles of grain, sprigs of lavender, folded bits of cloth, uncertain whether the marks were warning or gift. Theories bloomed slowly. A cursed brew, a gas from the ground, a visitation from spirits long bound to the land, a punishment for letting the old prayers lapse, an alchemical reaction from mold in the cellar stores. A chronicler from a nearby abbey was sent to investigate. His notes, preserved in an archive, described the villagers as calm but wary. He recorded the handprints with drawings, noting their perfect symmetry and odd placement. In one passage he writes, "They feel warm in the morning and cool by dusk, though the stone surrounding them remains steady." He did not offer an explanation, only that the villagers eventually came to live alongside the prince. Years passed. The feast was never repeated. The fermented drink was discarded, its recipe lost. Some families moved away. Others stayed, raising children who grew up with the marks and thought little of them. Eventually, even the abbey forgot. Centuries later, when a team of preservationists surveyed the remains of stone cottages in that region, long abandoned and covered in moss, they noted unusual discolorations along several walls. Most were dismissed as water damage or mineral deposits. But one researcher, familiar with obscure medieval records, quietly proposed a different idea. The size, the spacing, the location, they matched the drawings in the abbey's archive. Today, if you were to find the site, though the path is largely forgotten, you might still see one of those faint impressions. A shape almost, but not quite, human. Light against the stone. Waiting. So imagine yourself standing in that village, long after the roofs have fallen and the hearths have gone cold. The wind threads through empty doorways. The stone is silent. But under your fingertips, you feel the print of a hand. Unfamiliar, impossible, and softly enduring. A memory etched in the walls. Of a night when no one dreamed alone. End of script. 800 characters. Would you like the matching YouTube thumbnail prompt or a short SEO-friendly video description with timestamps? The tart that made a widow sleepwalk and speak the wall's secrets. Imagine a castle just after dusk. The day's warmth has drained from the stones. The corridors are dim, the torchlight low and flickering. A hush settles over the great hall as servants finish their tasks. Somewhere down the inner passageway, a narrow window lets in the sound of wind over the moor. The widow is already asleep. She has lived in the East Tower for 3 years now. Alone, but respected. Her husband, a stonemason who died in a fall during construction, left no children, but he left her a modest inheritance and quiet standing among the castle's household. She does not speak often. She keeps to her room. She bakes. It was one of her tarts, made with late autumn berries from the castle orchard, dark and small, sweet with an aftertaste of iron, that she ate the night it began. At first, no one noticed anything unusual, only that, in the middle of the night, the widow was seen walking, not pacing, not wandering, but moving with slow, precise steps along the corridor of the lower west wing, a place she had never entered in daylight. Her eyes were closed. Her lips moved faintly, as if in prayer. The guard did not wake her. In those days, sleepwalking was not seen as unnatural, merely unfortunate. He followed her to ensure she came to no harm. But then, she spoke, and what she said made him pause. The inner wall turns here, 10 hands wide, and hollow behind the lintel. He told the steward in the morning. The steward told the castellan. And the castellan, curious but skeptical, had the spot examined. Behind the lintel, behind the thick stone that had not been touched since the castle's earliest days, they found an air gap, exactly 10 hand widths deep, a space used by the original architect to reduce weight on the supporting wall. It had never been mapped, never drawn, and no one outside the original design team should have known. The widow had never seen the plans. She had no formal education. She could read, barely, and preferred her garden to company. She had never spoken of her husband's work in detail. He had been private, and his notes, like most master masons, had been kept in code or committed to memory. But over the next nights, she walked again, always in sleep, always just after midnight, and always speaking quietly about the walls. The stair behind the chapel turns twice, not once. The stones in the north wing are younger, less stable. They were relaid in secret. There's a sealed passage behind the pantry hearth. At first, these were treated as curiosity. Castle life was filled with peculiar stories. But when the carpenter removed a panel near the pantry hearth and discovered scorched brick laid over a bricked arch, sealed from within, the tone changed. This was no mere dream. Soon, the chamberlain ordered her watched. A monk was brought in to observe. He wrote in his journal, "She does not tremble. Her breath is even, but her speech is calm and without hesitation, as if reading from a scroll no other eye can see." And always, before the episodes began, she baked a tart of the same dark berries, not common fruits. These grew in a shaded corner of the orchard wall, slightly bitter, sometimes used in dye. Edible, yes, but rarely in large amounts. No one else ate them. No one else sleepwalked. The tarts were not confiscated, but she was asked, gently, not to bake them again. She agreed, smiling softly. and the walk stopped. For a time. But the memory lingered. The knowledge she spoke was not just architectural. It was intimate. She described gaps between walls, changes in stone type, old tool marks left behind where no torch had burned in decades. She spoke once of a keystone installed incorrectly, confirmed when a stonemason checked the arch above the old buttery. She mentioned a staircase that once connected two towers, now sealed, but known to a few elderly guards. Nothing she said was dangerous. Nothing scandalous. Only impossible to have known. A few theories emerged. Some said her husband had told her everything in secret, perhaps on long winter nights. Others suspected she had found his tools, or notes, and learned to interpret them. A few whispered that the berries she ate were mildly hallucinogenic, unlocking memories not hers to begin with. But some, especially the older servants, believed the walls had spoken back, that in her sleep she heard what others could not. Not magic, exactly, but memory. Stone, after all, was not silent. It creaked, it sighed, it cracked in the cold. It absorbed heat and breath and sound. And a castle built by hand, block by block, bore the shape of every person who touched it. Perhaps she had simply listened deeply enough. The tart, then, was not the cause, but the key. Something in the berries, something in her dreams, had loosened the knot between perception and structure. The widow lived quietly for many more years. She did not bake the tart again, or if she did, she kept it to herself. She remained respected, cared for, but gently avoided. Visitors asked to see her once or twice. A nobleman from the coast, a scholar from the university. She declined, but the guards kept watch, even years later. And sometimes, on moonless nights, they swore they saw her standing by the north wall. Eyes closed, head tilted, as if listening. No words, no movement, just stillness. The chronicler at the time left only one sentence in his notes. She listens to the stone as if it breathes, and speaks only when it forgets to lie. Today, the castle remains in partial ruin. The pantry hearth is sealed again. The plans lost. But a few strange drawings linger in the margins of an old steward's ledger. Simple outlines of hallways once thought forgotten, labeled in a hand that no mason could identify. And in one sketch, beside a list of preserved fruit stores for winter, is a recipe. Just 5 ingredients. And the note beside it. Do not bake alone, because once, long ago, a widow dreamed the layout of walls she had never seen, and spoke of stonework never carved for her eyes. All after a simple tart, and a night when the castle remembered something it had long tried to forget. The fermented grain that triggered stone dreams across a hamlet. Imagine a hamlet tucked between wooded hills and river mist. The houses are simple. Low stone walls, thatched roofs, wood smoke curling softly into the dusk. Chickens roost near doorways. A stream trickles beyond the last fence post. And in the center of it all, the communal oven breathes heat into the cooling air. On this evening, as on many before it, the villagers have gathered their dough, barley ground fine, fermented in earthen pots, then shaped into rough cakes for the coming week. But this batch is different. Soured longer, thicker. Its scent has deepened, too. Less yeasty, more earthy, with a faint edge of sweetness beneath the grain. They eat it as they always do, with salted root mash, with pickled greens, with hands dusted in flour. No one marks the moment the change begins. It doesn't strike like illness. It arrives slowly, almost softly. That night, no one dreams alone. By morning, the whisper has begun, first from the blacksmith's daughter, then the cooper's son, then from an old woman who rarely speaks. They all tell versions of the same vision. Narrow tunnels just behind their cottage walls, dark, still, and dry. They describe the sensation of walking through stone. of reaching dead ends, of hearing something breathe beyond the mortar. The dreams are not frightening, but they are strange in their sameness. And then someone begins to knock on the walls. It begins as curiosity. A tap here, a scrape there. Then, a loose board is pried away. A hollow sound behind a hearthstone. A crack beneath a lintel. And in one cottage, beneath a long-forgotten layer of plaster, they find it. A tunnel, not wide, barely large enough for a person to pass through crouching, but real, walled with stone, dry as dust, and leading not out, but inward, along the spaces between cottages. No one had ever spoken of them. No records mention such construction. But one by one, over the coming days, more are found. Behind cellar walls, under floorboards, in places that shouldn't hold space at all. The villagers begin calling them stone veins. Not quite passages, not quite rooms, just thin, intentional hollows. Some are sealed. Some seem to go nowhere. But they exist, and each one appears to align, uncannily, with descriptions given in the shared dreams. The fermented barley cakes, now mostly eaten, come under suspicion. They had been made as always, but this batch had used grain from the previous season, stored too long perhaps, exposed to moisture, or something older. Fungal spores, it's later speculated. Specifically, a mild strain of Claviceps purpurea, more commonly known today as ergot. A fungus that can grow on cereal grains and has been linked historically to hallucinations, trance states, and shared delusions. But that explanation doesn't fully satisfy, because what the villagers saw wasn't illusion. The tunnels were there, hidden, real, as if the dreams had not created them, but remembered them. And the dreams didn't stop, even after the bread was gone. Each night, more visions came. But now they diverged. Some dreamt of walking deeper, through the narrow stone, into chambers lit with unknown light. Others heard chanting, not in language, but in rhythm, a hum made of pressure and air. A few began to draw, symbols etched in ash on doorframes, spirals, arrows, shapes like doors. One child claimed to see her great-grandmother waiting at the end of a tunnel. She was made of dust and rock, the girl said. But she remembered my name. Some villagers grew uneasy. They blocked up the cracks, piled furniture in front of weak stone. A few sealed their hearths with new mortar, as if to forget. But others continued searching, digging, following. A small chamber was found behind the baker's wall. Square, dry, empty except for a flat slab at its center. Not a table, not quite an altar. Its edges were worn smooth, as if by many hands. On it, someone had carved a single mark, a spiral inside a square. The same symbol a boy had drawn in soot days before, without ever seeing the stone. What were these tunnels? Smuggling routes? Ritual paths? Structural remnants from an older foundation? Some archaeologists centuries later would guess at forgotten cellars, or even early ventilation systems. But the design was too deliberate, too narrow, too enclosed. They were not made for utility. They were made for passing through. Slowly, alone, the dreams faded over time, as the bread disappeared, as the season changed, as other rhythms took hold. But not entirely. Even a generation later, the village children told stories of tunnels that moved when no one looked, of walls that breathed, of footsteps heard beneath the floor. The term stone dreams became part of the local dialect, used to describe visions that linger just at the edge of waking, or truths hidden in plain view. Some said the grain had awakened a memory in the body, that we carry the shape of the place we live, and the right key, accidental or not, can unlock it. Others believed the tunnels were never meant to be found, that they were left behind not as paths, but as traps, or messages, or mirrors. What is certain is this: A village ate together, dreamed together, and then together rediscovered something that had waited silently behind their walls. Unmoving, unseen, yet always there. We often imagine stone as dead, fixed, thoughtless, but perhaps it listens. Perhaps, once in a great while, it speaks, and those who dream in its language hear. The strange lentil dish that made soldiers weep in their sleep. Imagine the edge of a military encampment just before dusk. Rows of canvas tents ripple in the wind, their ropes creaking softly. The air smells of earth, oil, and spent firewood. Nearby, in a blackened iron pot, a stew of lentils simmers over a low flame. The cook stirs slowly, adding a handful of herbs, a pinch of salt, and something else small, indistinct, and dark. Something he says is for warmth and for calm. By nightfall, the pot is empty. Dozens of soldiers, some bruised from battle, others just cold and hungry, return to their tents with full bellies and heavy limbs. There is no sign of trouble, just silence. Sleep follows swiftly, but by the next morning, the camp is uneasy. Not because of an attack, not because of illness, but because sometime during the night, many of the men had begun to weep. In their sleep, not from pain, but from a grief they could not name. The account comes to us from a set of military ledgers dated to the late 15th century, detailing a short-lived campaign along the edge of the Pyrenees. In one of the steward's brief reports, sandwiched between lists of supplies and marching orders, is a strange entry. Several wept in sleep after eating lentils. Voices were heard in the ramparts. No injuries, no cause. Further notes added in the margins by a chaplain describe what followed. Soldiers who could not be roused until late morning. Blank stares upon waking. Men who sat for long minutes in silence, then quietly asked, "Who is it we mourned?" Others remembered nothing, only the sensation of having lost something vast. The dish had been prepared in bulk, using dried lentils, bone stock, onion, and a mixture of herbs gathered from the hills. These included thyme and savory, but also lovage, lemon balm, and a regional root later identified in monastic texts as having mild soporific properties. Not poison, not hallucinogen, just softening. The recipe itself was not unusual. Lentils were common campaign fare. Filling, easy to store, simple to cook in large quantities. But something about this particular blend, on this particular night, settled into the soldiers not just as sustenance, but as sorrow. Those who did remember their dreams spoke of strange landscapes. One described standing at a dry riverbed filled with broken shields. Another dreamed of a voice humming a lullaby in a language he did not know. A third said only, "We stood in rows, but not for battle, for burial, and the sky was made of stone." Perhaps most curiously, some claimed that as they wept in sleep, the walls wept with them. The stone ramparts, rough, newly built, and still sharp with lime dust, were said to have echoed softly through the night. Not with footsteps, not with wind, but with a sound like distant sobbing. No source was found, no explanation offered, but more than one officer noted the strangeness. To understand why this mattered, we must remember what military camps were meant to be. Places of hardness, of readiness. Emotion was neither welcome nor practical, but the sobbing was not weakness, it was shared. No man wept alone. The tears were not remembered with shame, but with confusion, and by some, with relief. Some suspected a spiritual cause. One monk attached to the supply lines suggested that the herbs had softened the veil, that the soldiers, stretched thin by fatigue and fear, had tasted something not meant for them. Others believed the food had acted as a key, unlocking not just sleep, but grief long unspoken. War, after all, creates layers of silence. Mourning is often deferred, buried beneath duty. What if, in that moment of nourishment, the grief found its way back, The dish was not made again. The remainder was buried, though not from fear. The cook was not punished, but he was instructed to stick to simpler fare. Barley, root vegetables, nothing unusual. Still, the memory lingered. In later entries, the same steward noted odd quietness among the men in the days that followed. Fewer arguments, more shared tasks, as though something within them had realigned. The ramparts themselves were rebuilt within a year. Nothing unusual was noted in their structure, but in a faint bit of graffiti scratched into one low-facing stone, too faint for official mention, were the words, "The wall knows." This event was never made part of any formal military record. It was too strange, too intangible, and yet the story passed on in low voices. Around future fires, when lentils were served, someone might murmur, "Let the pot be plain," and others would nod. Not in fear, but in remembrance. Some modern historians have speculated about the ingredients: a mild sedative, a mold on the lentils. Others consider psychological explanations, the buildup of tension released in unison. But whatever the cause, the result was the same: shared dreaming, shared weeping, and the subtle feeling that something nearby had listened. So tonight, if your thoughts drift to a quiet camp at the edge of history, picture the heavy pot on the fire, the quiet chewing of soldiers seated in circles, the dark beyond the tents, and then the soft sounds of sleep, not restful, not troubled, but full of something vast and sorrowful, something they had carried too long. And in the silence that followed, the wind catching in the stones, sounding almost like breath, almost like memory, almost like the wall itself was mourning with them. Because for one night, it did. The mushroom pie that made a monk hear confessions from the walls. Imagine the hush of a medieval abbey, deep in the late afternoon stillness. The sun filters through narrow stained glass slits, scattering soft reds and blues across the flagstone floor. In the scriptorium, quills rest in their pots. In the kitchens, the scent of roasted onions, flour, and herbs lingers in the air, though the midday meal has long since passed. And in the cloister garden, a single monk walks slowly, his eyes fixed to the stone wall as though listening for something no one else can hear. Earlier that day, he had eaten a small portion of mushroom pie. It was not unusual fare. Wild mushrooms were commonly foraged by lay brothers and used in pies or pottages, especially during fasting seasons when meat was forbidden. The abbey's kitchen staff would have taken care, separating edible from dangerous varieties, relying on local knowledge passed down through generations of gardeners and cooks. But something about this particular pie was different. That evening, the monk, Brother Anselm, a quiet scribe known for his fastidious work and mild temperament, failed to appear for vespers. When found, he was seated cross-legged in the south transept, his eyes unfocused, his hands scrawling across a length of parchment. The words were in Latin, but not his own. He did not seem aware of what he was writing. When questioned gently by the abbot, he replied, "They are telling me what to write the walls. They whisper when the bell stops ringing." The abbot took the pages to his quarters. They contained full sentences, sometimes names, occasionally phrases such as, "I took the keys and opened the box," or "She was left by the stream, no one saw." Some were cryptic, others were unmistakably confessions, and yet, none of them matched Brother Anselm's usual hand. The difference was subtle. He was a trained scribe, and his style was disciplined. But the spacing, the pressure, even the way the loops of the letter G curled, these were wrong. The script bore the hallmarks of someone educated, but not Anselm. It was as if someone else had borrowed his hand. Initially, the abbot assumed exhaustion or mild illness. The work of copying texts was tiring, and mushrooms could cause mild stomach upset. But Anselm continued. Over the following week, he returned again and again to the same 3 spots in the abbey. the chapter house, the cloister walkway, and a narrow alcove near the crypt. And each time, he would pause, then begin scribbling. Sometimes he would weep as he wrote. Sometimes he would murmur fragments aloud. Once a novice overheard him say, "I never meant for her to drown." Words spread quietly. The other monks avoided those areas. Some reported hearing faint sounds near the stones, soft scratching, low sighs. The kitchen monks insisted no other pies had caused problems, and that the remaining batch had been discarded. Yet the idea had taken hold. Something had spoken to Anselm through the wall. Or something had been freed to speak by him. Chroniclers of the time, particularly monastic ones, handled such stories delicately. Visions were not uncommon in religious houses, and dreams or trances could be interpreted as divine inspiration or dangerous heresy. In Anselm's case, the abbey's own record refers to the incident obliquely. The brother was overtaken by a strange speech. He wrote what was not his. Another document in the diocesan archive refers to confessions born out of stone. Some modern scholars speculate that the mushrooms used in the pie may have been of a mildly psychoactive variety, such as those known to contain muscimol or psilocybin. The effects of such fungi can include dissociation, auditory hallucinations, and dreamlike states. If the mushrooms were stored improperly or misidentified, even a small amount could trigger such experiences, especially in someone who had fasted, prayed, or slept little. But that does not explain the handwriting, nor the consistency of the voice that emerged. For nearly a month, Brother Anselm continued to write, always in the same style, always in the same locations. The abbey eventually stopped supplying him with parchment and ink, hoping to break the pattern. He began using charcoal instead, scrawling across the backs of used manuscript scraps, or even the flagstones themselves. What he recorded grew darker. Betrayals between monks, secrets never voiced, accusations that, when investigated, found faint echoes in the abbey's long-forgotten ledgers. One confession referred to a hidden storeroom sealed after the fire. The storeroom was found. Its contents matched the description: burnt candlesticks, a shattered chalice, and singed hymnals from a fire no one alive remembered. Eventually, Anselm stopped, not abruptly, but gradually, as though the voice he had been transcribing had exhausted itself. He returned to his normal duties, quietly and without comment. He lived another decade, producing fine copies of psalters and homilies, but never spoke of the pie or the writings again. The writings themselves were collected and bound, then sealed away in the abbey's restricted library. Over time, some were lost, others were recopied anonymously, circulated among scholars of the strange and sacred. And the pie? No precise recipe was ever recorded, but in a surviving kitchen log, a marginal note reads, "No foraged pie to be served without elder tasting first." An unusual policy, but in a place where walls once whispered sins and a monk's hand wrote things he did not know, perhaps understandable. Today, if you walk the old abbey ruins, if they still stand, you might feel nothing. Just cool stone, moss, the echo of birdsong. But beneath your feet, beneath the quiet arches and long-gone cloisters, a few of those strange carvings remain, half erased, hidden under centuries of lime wash. And if you press your palm to the wall, perhaps, like Anselm, you might feel the faintest pressure of something remembered. Not by you, but by the stones. The soup that induced sleep and carved symbols into chapel stone. In a windswept region where the hills rise and fall like the folds of an old blanket, there once stood a chapel far from any town or village. Built of thick, dark stone and ringed with pines, it was the kind of place where silence seemed to settle in the eaves. Few visited it. Fewer still remembered its founding. And yet, for a time, it was home to a small brotherhood of clergy who lived by the clockwork of prayer, tending to the land, the altar, and the long hours between. Imagine yourself there, The year is uncertain, perhaps somewhere in the 1300s, though records are vague. The chapel is modest. Just a single nave, a wooden door that groans on its hinges, and a bell that tolls twice daily, echoing into the trees. Inside, the air always carries the scent of wax, cold ash, and damp stone. Candles line the edges, their light flickering softly against the rough interior. The brothers who lived here were quiet men. They tended their herbs, copied manuscripts, and spoke only when needed. Meals were simple: grains, roots, occasionally a small bird or fish if the season allowed. And once a week, on the Sabbath, a special soup was prepared. The recipe was old, older than the chapel, some said, passed down by word of mouth, never written. It was made from leeks, parsnips, and a handful of wild herbs gathered from the edge of the woods. The broth was thickened with lentils and stirred for hours until it smelled faintly of earth and sweetness. The brothers believed it aided contemplation, helped the body rest, so the soul could listen. One Sabbath, after the evening meal had been shared and the candles snuffed, the brothers lay down in their beds, as they always did. But this time, they did not rise with the bell, nor the next. It wasn't until nearly 2 full days later that the first of them stirred, confused and dry-mouthed, as if from a dream too long. When the last brother finally woke, the chapel's interior was unchanged, save for one thing. At the base of the stone altar, fresh carvings had appeared. Not scratches, not graffiti, symbols, deeply etched, clean-edged, and in no known hand. They were not part of any known script. Not Latin, not Greek, not runes. They spiraled, looped, and crossed in repeating forms, like patterns half-remembered from embroidery or weathered mosaics. The brothers had no explanation. No tools had been used. The chapel's single chisel remained locked in its chest untouched. The carvings hadn't been there before. Of that, they were certain. The altar had been washed just that morning, and yet now, the marks were deep, as if they had always been part of the stone. None of the brothers reported any dreams, only the sense, upon waking, that time had shifted somehow. One spoke of a stillness so vast it felt like falling. Another said he remembered voices, not speaking, but singing, though no words remained. A third claimed he'd seen a figure standing behind the altar in the dark. Though when pressed, he could not say whether it had been real or imagined. Word spread slowly. A passing monk from a nearby priory was sent to examine the chapel. His records still survive in a single, faded manuscript now held in an obscure archive. In it, he sketches the symbols and writes, "There is no tool here sharp enough, nor hand steady enough, to have made these in sleep or waking. The lines are as if grown from the stone itself." Debate followed, as it always does. Some blamed the soup, perhaps a misidentified herb with soporific qualities. Others whispered of older powers, of sacred grounds, of thin places where the boundary between time and meaning could be crossed. A few suggested an elaborate hoax, though no one could explain why, or how, it might have been carried out. The soup recipe was never made again. The herbs were burned. The altar was neither defaced nor cleansed. It remained as it was found, symbols and all. Over time, the chapel faded from active use. The brothers died, or were reassigned, and no new novices came. Eventually, the forest pressed in. The path grew over. The bell fell silent. Centuries later, during a regional land survey, the ruins were rediscovered. The roof had collapsed. Only the altar remained standing, surrounded by rubble and pine needles. The carvings, though weathered, were still faintly visible. The surveyor's notes mention them in passing, calling them decorative embellishments, though the angle of their depth suggests something far more deliberate. No further study was conducted. The stones were left as they were, quiet, half-forgotten, open to the wind and moss. But for those who still follow such stories, The tale of the chapel that dreamed while its keepers slept remains a curious intersection of faith, folklore, and the unknown. So imagine yourself standing in that crumbled chapel, years after the brothers have gone. The trees sway just beyond the broken walls. Sunlight filters in slantwise through a gap in the roof. And there, at the altar's base, lie the marks, unchanged, unexplained. Symbols not left by hand, but remembered by stone, and dreamed into being by a silence too deep to disturb. The pickled root that made peasants speak in the dead's voices. Imagine a thatched cottage in late winter. The wind is low, but constant. It pushes gently at the shutters. Inside, the hearth gives off more smoke than warmth. A clay jar is opened with care. One of the last. Inside, pale slices of pickled root glisten faintly in the firelight. Soft, sour, still edible. It is food for this time of year, when nothing grows and nothing fresh can be found. The family eats in silence, a few slices each, enough to quiet the ache. Then the lid goes back on. The jar is resealed. There are still weeks before the thaw. That night, the sleep is deeper than usual. The house is cold. The beds are crowded. But the strangeness begins not with a scream or a sound, only a whisper. At first, it seems like a dream. A child murmurs in her sleep. Then the grandmother stirs. And then, something else. A voice. Old, familiar, and gone for years. A name is spoken in the dark. Not by the sleeper, but through them. Over the following nights, more voices come. Different tones, different words, but always from the mouths of those asleep. Not shouts, not nonsense, but words spoken in the distinct cadence of the long dead. Relatives, neighbors, a mother's lullaby, a father's cough, a brother's phrase long since buried, and the walls begin to answer. It is not echo, exactly. It is tone, a faint mirroring. The stone seems to hold the resonance, letting it out slowly, like breath through cracks. No one records a word, but the feeling is unmistakable. The cottage, in those nights, is not empty. The cause, they say, was the root, a type of turnip or parsnip, possibly, preserved in sour brine during a damp autumn and stored too long in a wood-sealed crock. It had softened, taken on a slightly sweet taste. Unusual, but not unpleasant. The family had eaten it gratefully. They were not alone. Other cottages, further down the hill, nearer the woods, reported the same thing. Strange dreams. Sleep-talking. Familiar voices in the night. One woman claimed she heard her late sister recite a childhood rhyme. Another said her husband spoke in the voice of his grandfather, telling her where to find a hidden coin. She found it the next day, beneath the floorboard. None of these stories reached the manor at first, but then, the Reeves' own servants began to mutter in their sleep. And one night, a stable hand, who had no surviving family, spoke in the voice of a man long dead, a tenant buried after the first frost. The accent was old, the phrasing formal. It made the steward step back. Word reached the Lord. At first he laughed. A tale for the fire. Winter madness. Too many hungry nights. But the chronicler took note, especially when it was said that the manor's inner hall, built of stone, thick and dry, had begun to hold on to sound a little longer than it should. That voices spoken in one room echoed faintly through the next, not delayed, but altered. Not louder, just stranger. They called the effect hollowing, a soft answer from the wall, not in words but in tone, as if something behind the stone had once heard that voice, and now was trying to remember it. Some of the elders said this was not new, that certain foods, especially those long kept and fermented, could loosen the boundaries during the darker months. That old root, especially if pickled in a clay vessel sealed with pine pitch, might ferment in unexpected ways, enough to cloud the senses. to stir the memories not of the mind, but of the blood. One midwife said simply, "That root wakes things." Not everyone experienced it. The effect varied. Some slept deeply and spoke nothing. Others wept in their sleep. A few, on waking, said they remembered dreams not of the living, but of family members they had never met, great-uncles, forgotten cousins, ancestors buried without name. It did not frighten them. In fact, most who experienced it described a kind of comfort. The voice of a father, long dead. A lullaby remembered. Instructions murmured from a mother's tone. There were no curses, no threats, just memory, slipping back through the breath of the body. But it was not without consequence. Once spring came, and the roots were gone, the voices stopped. But something changed. Those who had spoken in sleep now kept quieter during the day. They listened more, watched the walls, as if some part of them still heard something that others did not. The manor cook ordered the root stores destroyed. Anything with soft skin or sour brine was thrown away. But a few families, it said, buried their last jars instead. Not out of fear, out of respect. And in later years, when a winter grew especially hard, some whispered of returning to that root, to that taste, not because it fed the belly, but because it reminded them they weren't alone, that something old still listened, and that perhaps in sleep, we remember more than we're meant to. Today, you'll find no mention of it in recipe books, no medicinal records, just a scattering of lines in local chronicles. Voices from the sleep, one writes. The winter of echoes, another. No one speaks the full story. But if you pass an old cottage in the hills during a late frost, and the hearth is still warm, and if the night is especially still, you might hear it. A name, a sigh, a phrase in a tone no one living still speaks. And if you do, don't be afraid. It's only memory, preserved, like root in brine, waiting to be opened and heard. Again, the buttered grain cakes that revealed a buried wall chamber. Imagine a quiet village after a harvest feast. The fields are bare now, golden stubble catching the last of the sunlight. Smoke drifts from chimney tops. The air smells of peat, of roasting roots, of cooling bread. And from every open doorway, you hear the sounds of soft celebration. Laughter trailing off, mugs being set down. The creak of benches as families lean into the warmth of full bellies and low firelight. This was the time for the grain cakes. Made only once a year, with the season's final stores of barley or rye. The cakes were thick, dense, and brushed with butter until their crust gleamed. They were shared after the last meal of the festival. Eaten slowly, sometimes with a drop of honey or boiled berries. A ritual more than a recipe, a gesture of survival. That night, every villager slept, but not as they usually did. They slept deeper, longer, and all at once. From elders to children, the entire village fell into silence that lasted through dawn, and then through the next. A few stirred at intervals, but never truly woke. No dreams were spoken of. No nightmares were reported, only a heavy, dreamless weight that draped over every bed and hearth. And then, as quietly as it had arrived, the sleep lifted. The village woke, and one boy, just 9 years old, walked to the edge of the meeting hall and placed his hand on the wall. Not uncertainly, not in play, but with calm, clear intention. "It's here," he said. The adults asked him what he meant. He didn't answer directly, only repeated, "The walls showed me. There's a room behind this." They humored him at first, a child, freshly awake from some strange sleep, pointing at stone. But then others came forward, not just children, adults too, men and women who had felt something in their sleep, a pressure behind the walls. A sense that the old hall wasn't quite as solid as it had always seemed. Eventually, they fetched tools. The wall in question was not exterior, but part of the oldest wing of the hall, built generations before, according to the memory of the village's oldest resident. The stone looked seamless, unbroken, but when the first section was tapped, it sounded different. Hollow. By midday, they had broken through. Behind the wall was a narrow passage of fitted stone, curving downward. Dust drifted like mist. The air was colder, stiller, and carried the faint smell of something untouched. At the end of the passage lay a chamber. Small, octagonal, walled in dark stone, dry despite the age. At its center stood a raised stone platform. Empty, unadorned. On the walls, markings, not written language, shapes, carvings that echoed, strangely, the spiral and chevron patterns later found in Neolithic sites far older than the hall itself. No one living had known it was there. No maps showed it. No stories told of it. The chamber seemed to predate not just the building, but possibly the village itself. A remnant folded into the foundation, sealed and forgotten, except not entirely, because the boy had seen it. In his words, not with eyes, with the stone. The villagers didn't know what to make of it. Some believed it was a miracle. Others feared it. A few wanted to reseal the chamber immediately. But the boy was insistent. It waited until we listened. And always, he returned to the cakes. The buttered grain cakes, he claimed, had softened the walls. Not literally, of course, but in some hidden sense. That during that long, strange sleep, the walls had spoken. Not in words, but in impressions, direction, weight. And in that space between waking and forgetting, he had been shown. A later account by a traveling friar, copied into a borderland chronicle, describes the event in more skeptical terms. He refers to mild intoxication from spoiled barley, hallucinatory states, and shared seasonal delusions. He dismisses the chamber as a storage pit, and the carvings as pagan ornament. But even he admits, the structure lay hidden, yet the child knew its place before stone was touched. This cannot be denied. So what caused the sleep? Modern speculation suggests that the cakes, stored slightly too long in damp conditions, may have developed a mild fungal growth, not unlike ergot. Such substances, even in small quantities, are known to produce altered perception, trance-like sleep, and vivid internal experiences. But again, the structure was real, the wall was real, and it waited. We often forget how porous history can be, how stone, which we see as solid and mute, has layers beneath. Foundations built on foundations, rooms swallowed by time, and every now and then something stirs. Not loudly, not with violence, but with suggestion, a whisper behind the mortar, a shape in the mind, and sometimes it takes only a small thing to open the door. An old grain, softened with butter, a night of shared sleep, a child waking with certainty. The chamber still exists, though the building around it has long since collapsed. The spiral carvings are faint now, softened by lichen and time. No platform remains, just the shape of where it once stood. But travelers who pass through the ruins often pause near the south wall. They say the wind feels different there, that it curls inward, that it listens, and some say if you press your palm to the stone and close your eyes just before dusk, you'll feel the pull too, as if the wall still remembers and waits. The roast meat that caused dreamwalkers to bleed from the hands. Imagine a long stone hall lit by flickering torches and the deep amber glow of a hearth. The air is rich with the scent of roast meat. Fat crackling, spices warming, juices pooling beneath silver knives. The plates are full. The guests are satisfied. Outside, the forest lies dark and silent. Inside, the noble's feast continues, warm, loud, indulgent. But by dawn, the laughter will be gone, replaced by smears of red along the stone corridors. and guests who cannot explain where they've been. The event, recorded in fragmented detail in a steward's report from the late 15th century, began as a simple celebration. A lord had returned from a successful winter hunt, his quarry dressed and roasted within hours. The meat, prepared by the household's best cook, was served with dark bread, wine steeped with juniper, and a heavy sauce of clove and elderberry. Rich, yes, but not unusual. What followed, however, was anything but ordinary. Shortly after midnight, the castle guards noticed strange movement. Figures drifting through the upper halls, hands brushing along the stone, footsteps that did not pause or change direction. Upon closer inspection, these figures were not intruders, but guests. Their eyes were closed, their limbs loose, and their palms bleeding. By morning, 6 guests were found in various parts of the manor, each barefoot, each dazed, each with slow, weeping wounds on their hands, and each with blood smeared across the walls in broad, wandering arcs. None remembered how they'd gotten there, but each, when asked, said the same thing. The walls were screaming. The steward's account, preserved in the estate's archive and later copied by a traveling scribe, provides several specific details. The bleeding, though not severe, was consistent across all who sleepwalked. Shallow gashes, as if the skin had split rather than been cut. The walls, checked immediately after, bore no roughness sharp enough to cause injury. And yet, the prints remained, crimson arcs, high and low, in chambers no one had entered for weeks. One guest claimed to have dreamt of a feast in reverse, meat unroasting itself, reforming into shape, leaping from the fire into the forest. Another described a corridor that narrowed with every step until the air itself pressed like stone. A third awoke saying only, "The voice was beneath the wall, not behind it." Though no one died, the Lord was shaken. The remainder of the meat, preserved for servants and dogs, was buried that same day, deep in the forest under ash and quicklime. The cook, confused and frightened, insisted the meat had come from healthy game and had been dressed properly. The spices, he admitted, were brought by a new merchant, clove and myrrh from the east, in a sealed pouch lined with wax. But he had tasted them himself. There had been nothing strange. Some physicians later suggested a mild poisoning, perhaps something in the meat or a fungus on the grain fed to the animals. Others suspected a form of mass hysteria. But what disturbed observers most was the consistency. All 6 guests followed near-identical paths through the manor. Their hands reached the same heights. Their speech, when it came, was nearly identical in tone. More than one servant noted that the words spoken in sleep were not pleas or cries, but listening sounds. Pauses, hums, whispers of acknowledgement, as if the walkers were not calling out, but responding. And always that phrase returned. The walls were screaming. In the months that followed, sections of the manor were repainted, tapestries rehung. The upper west hallway, where the prints were thickest, was sealed entirely, cited as structurally unsound. The incident was never made public, but its effects lingered. No guests slept in the upper rooms again. Meals became simpler. The merchant who sold the spice was never found. The manor itself remained standing for over a century before falling into disuse. When portions were excavated in the 19th century, red stains were discovered beneath several layers of plaster in the sealed hallway, aged to a dark rust, impossible to remove. Later historians debated the event. Could the meat have carried a contaminant? Could shared suggestion or environment have induced such vivid, synchronized behavior? Perhaps. But those who study architecture and folklore offer another interpretation. In medieval belief, buildings were not simply passive. They were containers of memory, capable of reflecting the energy brought into them. A house could turn cold after betrayal. A monastery could echo grief. A castle, saturated with fear or secrecy, might listen more than it was meant to, might even speak back. And in this case, some speculate that the act of the feast, the meat taken, the fire kindled, the ritual of hunger and satisfaction, may have stirred something beneath the manor's surface. Something forgotten, or buried, something that used the guests not to hurt, but to express. After all, the wounds were shallow, the movement slow. The voices, though strange, were not screams, but echoes, as if the guests unwittingly became the voices the walls could not produce alone. So tonight, imagine that quiet hall once more, the hearth now cold, the dishes cleared, the guests retired, but in the stone above and around them, something waits. Something that does not speak in words, but in movement, in blood lightly smeared, in palms open to stone, and in dreams where the building itself remembers, because some meals nourish the body, others awaken the house. The herbal broth that made a court hear lost voices in stone. Imagine the dining hall of a noble court in late winter. Heavy beams overhead, a hearth glowing low, and tall windows obscured by frost. The fire crackles, but the room is hushed, slower than usual. Platters have been cleared, goblets sit half full, and before each guest the final course. A small bowl of broth, fragrant with unfamiliar herbs. It had been a gift, prepared by a visiting herbalist from the far provinces. A simple gesture, said the steward. Something to warm the bones, to steady the mind before the long thaw of spring. The guests accepted it politely. They were noble, but not above curiosity. The broth was greenish, almost luminous by firelight. It tasted earthy, tinged with thyme and something sharper, slightly metallic. Most drank it without question. Some asked after the recipe. None expected what would follow. That night, the entire household slept, not in their usual restless shifts, but all, lords, ladies, stewards, scribes, succumbed to a sleep so complete that no guards were posted, no fires were stoked, and no candles burned past midnight. And when they awoke, the walls had changed, not in structure, not visibly, but in sound. It began subtly. A lady-in-waiting reported hearing a distant whisper while brushing her hair, though no one stood behind her. A chamberlain paused mid-inventory, swearing he'd heard his deceased uncle's voice just behind the west pillar. Then came the others. The steward said he heard the stones humming. The cook swore the scullery wall exhaled a word, his childhood nickname, long forgotten. And the Lord himself, normally rational, dismissed such claims, until he entered the chapel and heard, by the altar, a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years. His mother, reciting an old family poem once sung to him before bed. It wasn't just voices. It was memories, secrets, old phrases once whispered between siblings, confessions never written, regrets unspoken. And they came not from people, but from the stone. Not everyone heard the same things. One hall might murmur to a passing maid, but remain silent to her friend. The messages were brief, fleeting, sometimes only a single word, but always something deeply familiar, something once real. Panic did not set in, but a strange reverence took hold. Conversations grew cautious. Movement slowed. People glanced at the walls before speaking. It was as if the architecture had joined the court, not as background, but as participant. Chroniclers recorded the event carefully. One entry in the castle's daily book reads, "The south wall near the tapestry repeated the countess's name 3 times in a child's tone." Another notes, "The eastern stair sang a hymn known only to those buried in the crypt." Physicians were summoned. They examined the guests, found no illness, no fever. Yet nearly all described the same sensations. Sounds without source, voices without speakers. Some guests attempted to map the experiences, marking columns and corridors where certain messages recurred. But no pattern emerged. What sang to one would remain silent to another. As suspicion grew, attention turned back to the broth. It had been made, apparently, from wild herbs gathered along the edge of a forest, known for its strange stones and twisted roots. The herbalist had since departed, traveling eastward beyond easy reach. The steward who had commissioned the dish remembered only that it had included valerian, mugwort, and a rare mossy growth that clung to old stones near springs. It was never served again, and still for days the court lingered in that altered quiet. It was not sleep-inducing now, but haunting. The walls whispered less as time passed, as if retreating. A few courtiers claimed that the voices had moved deeper into the structure, that they now only echoed in the oldest beams or in the crypt stairs. By the end of the week, only 2 servants reported hearing anything. By the following month, the phenomenon had ceased entirely. What had caused it? Some believe the herbs induced a collective hallucination, a blend of sleep, suggestion, and the powerful psychology of shared space. Others claim the stone itself, long saturated with generations of speech, was temporarily made porous, opened by the compound to release what it had long absorbed. A memory leak of sorts. Architecture in the medieval mind was never inert. Buildings were considered vessels of meaning, character, and mood. Stones were believed to hold warmth, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The idea that they might remember was not so alien, and the court never fully dismissed what they'd heard. Guests became more measured. The Lord held fewer banquets. Conversations turned inward. The great hall's tapestry was replaced, not because it was worn, but because it had hung near the pillar that repeated the name of a long-dead child. Some years later, a visiting abbot was told the tale and asked the steward if the soup had been cursed. The steward, by then much older, only replied, "If it was a curse, it was spoken gently. Today, the castle is a ruin. Stone walls open to wind and ivy, the hearths cold, the floors uneven. Tourists pass through, unaware of the strange week when the court went quiet and the walls told their stories. But in the crypt beneath the chapel, carved into one of the supporting stones, is a single Latin phrase, crudely etched, easily overlooked. It reads, Vocem audivi quae non erat mea. I heard a voice that was not mine, and beside it the faint outline of a bowl. Just one, forgotten by history, but not, perhaps, by the stone. The baked loaf that revealed hidden names etched in the cellar wall. In a quiet border village near what is now the edge of northern Alsace, where forests once grew thick and uncut, a modest farmhouse stood watch over a narrow slope. The land was neither rich nor poor, just enough to keep a family fed and warm through most winters. The house itself was unremarkable. Stone foundation, timber frame, a loft above, and a cellar below that stayed cool even in the sunniest months. But one season, something strange happened there. Not loud, not violent, but peculiar. The kind of story that slips between generations like mist between trees. Imagine yourself in that house, sometime in the 1500s. The air outside is heavy with late summer. Inside, the kitchen is filled with the scent of flour and yeast and warm stone. A woman stirs a pot over the fire, while her eldest kneads dough on a board smoothed by years of use. They are preparing bread, an old recipe, passed down from a grandmother long buried. It was known in the household as remembering bread. Made with a starter that had been kept alive for generations, it was mixed with crushed fennel and a pinch of sweet clover. No one was quite sure why it was made only once a year, or why it was never served to guests. That night, the loaf rose slowly, its crust blooming dark and golden in the hearth oven. The family ate it warm, dipping pieces into broth and honey. There was laughter, a simple candlelit meal. They went to bed content, and did not wake for 3 days. Not all at once, and not in pain. But the house remained still. No one opened the shutters. No fire was stoked. The animals outside grew restless. A cousin from a nearby cottage eventually came to check on them. He found the entire household asleep, pale, breathing, unmoving. The food had spoiled, the broth congealed. On the morning of the fourth day, the youngest child, a boy of 7, awoke screaming, not from illness or nightmare, but with a word. Names. Over and over, he said it. Names in the stone. Names in the dark. He would not go back to sleep. He would not eat. He simply pointed toward the floor, then toward the cellar door. At first, the family dismissed it as dream confusion. But the boy's fear did not pass. Eventually, his father lit a lantern and descended the steps to the cellar, ducking under the beam worn smooth by generations. He scanned the stone walls, already cool with autumn damp. Nothing. Just bare stone, the faint white of salt efflorescence, and a few scraps of old shelving. But then, on the far wall, just beside the root bins, he noticed something unusual. Scratches in the stone, but not like tool marks. More like softened grooves. Faint, patterned. They fetched a chisel and a brush. As they scraped away the top layer, years of lime wash, dust, and flaking plaster, lines began to appear. Curves, slashes, letters. Not random graffiti, but names. Dozens of them. Some partial, some faded, but all etched into the stone beneath the surface layer, as though hidden deliberately. The handwriting varied. Some were deeply inscribed, others shallow. Many had dates beside them, most from decades earlier. A few from more than a century past. The family recognized none of them. They weren't ancestors. They weren't locals. And yet, one name stood out. The boy's own, carved near the bottom, with a date that matched the very year of his birth. It was not possible. The family consulted the local priest, who consulted a visiting scholar from the city. The verdict was inconclusive. Some suggested the bread had caused a collective dream state, a hallucination, perhaps from spoiled grain or wild herbs with soporific properties. Others whispered of older practices, of protective naming rituals, or forgotten prayers meant to bind spirits to places. But no one could explain how the names had been placed beneath sealed plaster, or why the boy's name, carved with unsettling precision, had appeared alongside them. After some discussion, the cellar was sealed. The wall was covered again, this time with stone and mortar. The family moved their stores elsewhere. The starter used for the bread was discarded in the stream, though the mother kept a small lump in a jar, quietly, without telling the rest. She said it felt wrong to throw it all away. Life resumed, more or less, but the boy never entered the cellar again. And each year, on the same evening as the original feast, he would lock his door and sleep with a candle burning. Centuries later, the house fell into disuse. The upper beams gave way to rot. The roof collapsed. A team of restoration workers visited during a local preservation effort. While clearing the cellar, they discovered signs of past masonry work, an inner wall built within the original foundation. When dismantled, they found the stone beneath still bearing faint, deliberate carvings. The names were no longer legible. Time had worn them smooth. But their presence remained. Shallow traces of letters, half sunk into the stone. No tools were found in the debris. No known records explained why they were there. Just a memory of something once hidden. Something called forth by a loaf of bread, shared on a quiet night. So imagine yourself standing there, in the cool stillness of that cellar. The air is thick with age and silence. You press your hand to the wall. Feel the texture, rough, layered, faintly warm from within. Not haunted, not cursed. Just remembered, etched, like names on old bread, waiting beneath the surface, until sleep gives them shape.